May 10, 1869. Promontory Summit, Utah Territory. Two locomotives face each other on a single track. The air tastes of sagebrush and steam. Champagne corks pop. Photographers position their cameras. Telegraph wires hum with anticipation as the nation waits for a signal that will change America forever. A golden spike, 4 ceremonial taps. Then the message clicks across the continent. Done. The Transcontinental Railroad is complete. 1,776 miles of iron connecting the Atlantic to the Pacific. 6 years of construction, tens of thousands of workers, and a human cost so staggering, so deliberately hidden, that the true price of this achievement would be buried for generations. Beautiful, yes. A triumph of American engineering and ambition, but that's just the facade. Behind the photographs are mass graves in the Sierra Nevada. Behind the celebrations are Chinese laborers dynamiting through solid granite, 60 at a time, for wages half what white workers earned. Behind the golden spike are fortunes built on land theft, government bonds, and creative accounting that would make a modern hedge fund blush. 2 companies. Central Pacific pushing east from Sacramento, Union Pacific driving west from Omaha, racing toward the middle, each mile worth government subsidies and land grants. The faster they built, the richer they became. And if workers died by the hundreds, that was the cost of progress. Can a nation be born from iron and blood without reckoning the bill? And the real question, who actually paid for the Transcontinental Railroad? And how much did this dream cost in lives, land, and lies? If you enjoy deep investigations into America's railroad history and the workers who built it, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which railway to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Thank you for being here. Let's begin. The Vision. 1850s, California. Gold fever has drawn hundreds of thousands west. But the journey is brutal. Overland by wagon train takes 6 months through hostile territory, disease, and starvation. By sea around Cape Horn takes even longer. Through the Panama Isthmus means tropical disease and robbery. Consider what this means in human terms. A family in Boston decides to seek fortune in San Francisco. They have 3 choices, all terrible. Choice 1, wagon train. 6 months across the Great Plains, through Indian Territory, over mountain passes that close with snow for half the year. Cholera kills by the hundreds in the cramped camps. Water goes bad in barrels. Children die of dysentery. Wagons break axles in river crossings. The Donner Party, trapped in the Sierra Nevada in the winter of 1846, resorted to cannibalism. That story was still fresh in 1850. Everyone knew it. Everyone feared becoming it. Choice 2, ship around Cape Horn. 4 to 6 months at sea, through some of the most violent waters on Earth. Ships sink. Scurvy hollows out gums and loosens teeth. The cost, $300 to $500 per person, is prohibitive for most. And when you finally arrive, weakened and broke, San Francisco's chaos swallows you whole. Choice 3. The Panama route. Shorter in distance but deadlier in practice. Ship to Panama's Atlantic coast. Cross 50 miles of jungle on foot or mule through yellow fever and malaria zones. Board another ship on the Pacific side. If you survive the crossing, you've still spent months and a small fortune. America is split. The East Coast thrives with industry and population. The West Coast explodes with gold and possibility. Between them, 2,000 miles of prairie, desert, and mountains that might as well be an ocean. The economic problem is stark. California produces wealth, gold, timber, agricultural products, but it can't ship goods east efficiently. Eastern manufacturers want to sell to California's booming population, but freight costs are astronomical. Mail takes weeks. News travels at the speed of horses. The idea isn't new. Railroad visionaries have dreamed of spanning the continent since the 1830s. Asa Whitney, a New York merchant, proposed a Pacific Railroad in 1845. Theodore Judah, an engineer, became obsessed with the idea in the 1850s, spending years surveying routes through the Sierra Nevada, often at his own expense. But the obstacles are staggering. The obstacles. Cost. Engineers estimate $100 million, equivalent to roughly $3 billion today. No private company has that kind of capital. The federal government is reluctant to fund what many consider a fantasy, a boondoggle that will enrich speculators and produce nothing but wasted track in the wilderness. Terrain. The Rocky Mountains and Sierra Nevada present walls of granite rising over 7,000 feet. The Sierra Nevada, Judah's obsession, poses a particular nightmare. The range rises abruptly from the Sacramento Valley, climbing from near sea level to over 7,000 feet in less than 100 miles. Passes are narrow and steep. Tunneling technology is primitive. Black powder is the best explosive available, and it's slow, dangerous, and inefficient. Winter snowfall in the high passes can reach 40 feet. Avalanches sweep mountainsides clean. The construction season is short, perhaps 4 months a year at elevation. The Rocky Mountains, though less abrupt, stretch for hundreds of miles. The route through them, following the Platte River Valley and South Pass in Wyoming, is gentler but still crosses high desert where water is scarce and supply lines stretch for hundreds of miles. Labor. Who will build it? Where will workers come from? How do you house, feed, and supply thousands of men in wilderness hundreds of miles from civilization? The work is brutal, dangerous, and endless. Grading roadbeds through mountains, laying ties and rails by hand, blasting tunnels through solid rock, building bridges over canyons. Most men, if they have options, won't choose this work. Technology. Railroads are proven in the East, but the scale is different. Eastern railroads run through settled country with towns, suppliers, and repair facilities. The Transcontinental will cross vast stretches where none of that exists. Every spike, every rail, every tool must be shipped from foundries back east, thousands of miles away. Locomotives must be built, disassembled, shipped by sea around Cape Horn or through Panama, then reassembled on the coast. And there's a deeper problem, one nobody wants to say aloud. The railroad will cross territory inhabited by native peoples for thousands of years. The Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Pawnee, Shoshone, Paiute, and others. Treaties exist, signed and ignored with regularity. The railroad will violate many of them. The builders know this. The investors know this. The government knows this. The question is not whether there will be conflict, but how much blood it will cost. The political battle. Politics. North versus South. Each region wants the railroad to follow its preferred route, securing economic advantage for decades. The debate paralyzes Congress for years. Southern politicians, led by Jefferson Davis, then Secretary of War, advocate for a southern route. Across Texas, through New Mexico territory, into Southern California. The route is flatter, the passes lower, the winters milder, and it would run through slave states and territories, strengthening the South's political power. Northern politicians want a central route, through Iowa, Nebraska, Wyoming, Utah. It serves free states and territories. It links the industrial Midwest to California, and it would open the Great Plains to homesteaders, most of whom would come from northern states and bring free labor, not slaves. The debate is bitter and endless. Every session of Congress in the 1850s sees railroad bills introduced, debated, and killed. Southern Democrats block northern routes. Northern Republicans block southern routes. Stalemate. Then comes 1861, the Civil War. Southern legislators leave Congress. Northern Republicans, suddenly holding overwhelming majorities, seize their chance. The Pacific Railroad Act of 1862. President Lincoln signs the Pacific Railroad Act on July 1, 1862. The nation is tearing itself apart. Union armies are bleeding in Virginia. The outcome of the war is far from certain. Yet Lincoln believes in the railroad, not just as transportation, but as vision, a symbol that the Union will survive, that America will stretch from sea to sea, united by iron. The legislation is audacious. Two companies will build the railroad. The Union Pacific will begin in Omaha, Nebraska, and build west. The Central Pacific will start in Sacramento, California, and build east. They will meet somewhere in the middle. The exact meeting point is left vague, deliberately. Each company will want to build as many miles as possible. Competition will drive speed. The incentive structure is brilliant and corrupt in equal measure. Government bonds. For each mile of track laid, the railroad companies receive federal bonds. $16,000 per mile on flat prairie, $32,000 per mile in foothills, $48,000 per mile in mountains. The bonds are essentially loans, but with generous terms and deferred repayment. The interest is low. The due date is decades away. In practice, much of it will never be fully repaid. But here's the trick. The companies don't receive the bonds immediately upon laying track. They receive them once the government inspector certifies the work meets standards. That creates a cash flow problem. Building track costs money now. Bonds arrive later. The companies must find investors willing to bridge the gap, and those investors demand their cut. Land grants. For every mile of track, the companies receive alternating sections of land extending 10 miles on each side of the route. A section is 1 square mile, 640 acres. The pattern is a checkerboard. The railroad gets every other square. The government retains the rest. Later amendments in 1864 will double the grant to 20 miles on each side. In total, the railroads will acquire over 20 million acres of public land. That's larger than the state of South Carolina, larger than the nations of Belgium, Netherlands, and Denmark combined. The bonds must be repaid. The land is free. Sell it to settlers at $2 to $10 per acre. Lease it to ranchers. Mine it for coal, gold, silver, copper. Timber it for lumber. The land grants alone will make the railroad barons wealthier than kings. But there's a catch. The companies must complete the railroad by 1876, the centennial of American independence, 14 years from the signing. Miss that deadline and they forfeit everything. The bonds come due. The land reverts to the government. The incomplete railroad becomes a monument to failure. The pressure is immense, and that pressure will cost lives. The men who would be kings. Central Pacific, Sacramento. 4 shopkeepers meet in a back room above a hardware store. Leland Stanford, age 38, a grocer turned politician. He failed in the grocery business back in Albany, New York. Came west during the gold rush, tried mining, failed at that too. Opened a store in Sacramento selling supplies to miners. Made modest money. Parlayed connections into politics. In 1861, he was elected governor of California on the Republican ticket. He'll serve 1 term, use the office to advance the railroad, then parlay railroad wealth into a U.S. Senate seat. When he dies, his wife will found Stanford University with railroad money as a memorial to their son. Stanford is not brilliant. He's not even particularly competent. What he has is ambition and connections. He's the public face, the politician who can smooth the way in Sacramento and Washington. Collis P. Huntington, age 41, a hardware merchant. Born poor in Connecticut, worked his way west, settled in Sacramento, opened a hardware store with his partner, Mark Hopkins. When miners needed picks, shovels, and blasting powder, Huntington supplied them. He's shrewd, ruthless, and brilliant at finance. He'll spend much of the next decade in New York and Washington, lobbying Congress, manipulating bond markets, and securing supplies. His personal correspondence, preserved in archives, reveals a man who viewed bribery and political manipulation as simply the cost of doing business. Mark Hopkins, age 49, an accountant, the cautious one. always questioning costs, always counting dollars. He and Huntington are partners in the hardware business and will remain partners in the railroad. Hopkins keeps the books. He's the brake on the other's wilder schemes. When he dies in 1878, his estate will be valued at $20 million. His widow will marry his adopted son, causing a scandal, and build one of San Francisco's most opulent mansions on Nob Hill. Charles Crocker, age 40, a dry goods merchant, big, loud, over 250 pounds, with a voice that carries across a construction site. Born in New York, came west in 1849, tried mining, switched to selling supplies. Crocker will run construction with an iron fist. He's not an engineer, but he's a driver. Men who work for him learn quickly, produce, or be fired. He'll personally supervise the hiring of thousands of Chinese workers and will defend their performance, even as he pays them half what white workers earn. Together, they'll be known as the Big Four. They're not engineers. They're not railroad men. They're businessmen who see an opportunity to become unimaginably wealthy. And they'll use every trick, legal and otherwise, to maximize their take. Theodore Judah, age 36. He's the engineer, the true believer. Judah surveyed a route through the Sierra Nevada, spending months in the mountains with his wife Anna, mapping grades and passes. He convinced the Big Four to invest in the Central Pacific. He believes the railroad will unite the nation, transform commerce, and stand as a monument to American ingenuity. Judah doesn't realize his partners see only profit. By 1863, tensions will flare. The Big Four want to maximize miles built, to maximize subsidies, even if it means shoddy work. Judah wants quality and integrity. They'll force him out. In October 1863, Judah will travel east to find new investors willing to buy out the Big Four. Crossing Panama, he'll contract yellow fever. He'll die in New York on November 2, 1863, age 37. His dream will be built, but not by the men he would have chosen. Union Pacific, Omaha. A different cast, but the same appetite. Thomas Durant, age 42. Vice President and the real power. Trained as a doctor but never practiced. He made his first fortune smuggling contraband cotton out of the South during the Civil War. He's a speculator, a schemer, a man who sees every deal as an opportunity to extract maximum profit with minimum risk. He'll create a dummy construction company called Crédit Mobilier of America to siphon off millions while building the railroad at inflated costs. The Ames brothers, Oakes and Oliver. Massachusetts congressmen and industrialists. Their family company manufactures shovels, tools essential for railroad construction. They'll provide political cover in Congress and investment capital for the Union Pacific. Their involvement in Crédit Mobilier will later trigger one of the biggest corruption scandals in American history. Oakes Ames will be censured by Congress in 1873 and will die months later, broken and disgraced. Grenville Dodge, age 31, chief engineer, a genuine railroad man and former Union Army general. Dodge surveyed routes through Iowa and Nebraska before the war. During the war, he commanded troops in the Western Theater and rebuilt railroads Sherman's troops destroyed. After the war, Grant personally recommended Dodge to Durant. Dodge is competent, honest, and deeply frustrated by Durant's corruption. He'll threaten to quit multiple times, but stays because he believes in the work. And over them all, the shadow of President Lincoln, desperate to bind the nation with iron before it tears itself apart. The dream is set, the money is authorized, the land is promised. Now comes the hard part, building it. The first miles. January 8, 1863, Sacramento, California. A ceremony. Shovels turn earth. Governor Stanford, ceremonial shovel in hand, breaks ground. Speeches promise glory. Bands play. A crowd cheers. Then reality sets in. The Central Pacific must cross the Sierra Nevada, a granite wall rising 7,000 feet in less than 100 miles. The grade is punishing, climbing 7,000 feet in 105 miles, an average of 66 feet per mile, but in places reaching 116 feet per mile, the steepest mainline railroad grade in America. The tunnels will be the longest ever attempted in America, and California, freshly drained of men by the gold rush and the Civil War, has almost no available labor. Charles Crocker takes charge of construction. His first workforce, local white men, veterans, and drifters. They're unreliable, demand high wages, and quit whenever something easier or more lucrative appears. Silver strikes in Nevada pull men away by the hundreds. Harvest season drains the labor pool. A man can earn $3 a day with a pick and shovel on the railroad, but he can earn $5 or $10 panning for gold or digging silver if he gets lucky. By 1864, the Central Pacific has laid 50 miles of track across the flat Sacramento Valley. Progress is acceptable, but ahead looms the mountain. Crocker needs thousands of workers, reliable ones, cheap ones, workers who won't quit when the work turns brutal. Someone, the historical record is unclear who, suggests Chinese laborers. The Chinese. Crocker is skeptical. Chinese immigrants have been in California since the gold rush, mostly in mining camps and San Francisco. They're small, he thinks. They average 110 to 130 pounds. How can they handle brutal physical labor? Can they work in snow and cold? Are they strong enough to swing a sledgehammer, push a wheelbarrow of rock, drill through granite? James Strobridge, Crocker's construction superintendent, is blunt. I will not boss Chinese. Strobridge is Irish, a hard man shaped by hard work. He's 34 years old, missing part of one leg from a blasting accident years earlier, walks with a limp and a cane. He knows construction, he knows men, and he doesn't believe the Chinese can do the work. Crocker is desperate. He authorizes a trial. 50 Chinese workers are hired at $26 per month, less than the $35 white workers demand. They work harder than anyone expected. They arrive before dawn, work through the day without complaint, keep their camps clean, cook their own food, and don't drink whiskey or brawl at night. Within weeks, Crocker orders more. By 1865, the Central Pacific employs 3,000 Chinese workers. By 1866, that number reaches 10,000. By 1867, 12,000, roughly 90% of the entire workforce. They earn $26 to $35 per month. White workers earn $35 plus room and board. Chinese workers must pay for their own food and housing out of their wages. They live in tents or crude barracks made from scrap lumber. They cook their own meals, mostly rice, dried fish, and vegetables sent from San Francisco. They boil their drinking water, a practice white workers mock until dysentery sweeps through white camps and leaves the Chinese camps largely untouched. Who are these men? Most are from Guangdong province in southern China. Many are Tanka, boat people, or Hakka, guest people, ethnic minorities facing discrimination in China. They come to America, Gamsan, Gold Mountain, to earn money to send home to families. A laborer in China might earn $3 to $5 per month. In California, even after paying for food, a worker can send $15 or $20 home monthly. It's a fortune. It's survival for parents, wives, children left behind. Most plan to work a few years, save money, return home. Most never will. Cape Horn. The railroad reaches Cape Horn, a cliff face above the American River Canyon, 2,000 feet of vertical granite with the river far below. The route must cling to the rock, a shelf carved 1,400 feet above the water, narrow enough that a single locomotive and tender barely fit. There's no room to work from above with conventional methods. Workers must be lowered in wicker baskets from the clifftop, dangling in midair, hundreds of feet above the rocks and water. They chip handholds into the granite with hammers and chisels. They drill holes for black powder charges. They load the holes with powder, pack them with clay, insert fuses, light them, and signal frantically to be pulled up before the blast. Sometimes the signal is missed. The men hauling the ropes are working blind. They can't see the man in the basket around the curve of the cliff. Sometimes they're slow. Sometimes the fuse burns faster than expected. Sometimes the rope breaks. Bodies fall. They tumble down the cliff face, bouncing off projections and smash onto the rocks below or disappear into the river. Recovery is impossible. The work continues. Hung Hua. That's the only name that survives in a letter from a missionary. He was 19 years old. He'd been in California for 8 months. He was in a basket at Cape Horn when the powder charge detonated early. The blast tore the basket apart. His body was never found. The crew noted the loss in the daily log, assigned another worker to his position, and continued the work. How many men died at Cape Horn? The Central Pacific kept no records. White foremen estimated deaths with shrugs. A dozen, maybe? Hard to say, they all look alike. Not many, considering. Estimates range from dozens to over 100 at Cape Horn alone. The work took months. The ledge holds. Trains will run along that shelf for 150 years. But how many bones rest at the bottom of the American River Canyon, we will never know. The Summit Tunnels. The railroad reaches the High Sierra. Ahead lie the Summit Tunnels, 15 in all, totaling over 1,600 feet through solid granite. Tunnel number 6, the Summit Tunnel, is the longest at 1,659 feet. It will take 2 years to complete. The method is primitive. 8-hour shifts, 3 shifts per day. Drill holes by hand into rock. Steel drill bits 18 inches long held by one man while another swings an 8-pound sledgehammer. Strike. Turn the drill 1/8 rotation. Strike. Turn. Strike. Turn. Hour after hour. The driller's hands blister, then callous. The striker's shoulders burn. Granite dust fills the air. Men cough constantly. Lungs scar. Silicosis, miner's lung, will kill many years after the railroad is finished. After drilling holes in a pattern, 3 feet deep, spaced carefully, workers pack them with black powder. 15 to 20 holes per blast. Each charge carefully measured, each fuse cut to length. Light the fuses in sequence. Run. Wait for the blast. Let the smoke clear. That takes hours in the close confines of a tunnel. Return. Clear the rubble by hand, loading it into carts, wheeling it out. Repeat. Progress. 8 inches per day in solid granite per shift. That's 3 shifts, drilling, blasting, clearing, for a total advance of 2 feet per day if everything goes well. At that rate, Tunnel 6 will take over 2 years. Then, nitroglycerin arrives. James Howden, a Scottish chemist, is hired to manufacture it on site. Nitroglycerin is 7 times more powerful than black powder. It can shatter rock, black powder only chips. But it's catastrophically unstable. Jarring, heat, or even rough handling can detonate it. Transportation is deadly. A bottle in a wagon hits a rut. The wagon, the driver, the mules, 15 men standing nearby, all vanish in a flash and a roar that echoes off the mountainsides. One account, from a foreman's letter preserved in California State Archives, describes the aftermath of such an explosion. We found pieces no larger than a man's hand. We gathered what we could into a canvas sack and buried it. There was no way to know who they had been. Nitroglycerin triples the pace. Tunnel 6 advances 6 feet per day on good days. But the dying accelerates. Premature detonations, fumes that suffocate, collapses that crush. One worker's job is to enter the tunnel after a nitroglycerin blast before the others to check for unexploded charges. Men picked for this duty rarely lasted more than a few weeks. Either an unexploded charge killed them, or the fumes did, or their nerves broke and they refused to go back in. Ah Toy, age 23. He'd been drilling in Tunnel 6 for 8 months. A shaped charge detonated while he was setting the next round of holes. The blast drove granite shards through his body. He lived for 3 hours, coughing blood, unable to speak. His crew boss recorded the death in a ledger. 1 Chinaman, Tunnel 6, blast accident. His body was shipped to San Francisco, bones cleaned and prepared, then sent back to China in a wooden box paid for by his village association. Winter in the Sierra is a special hell. Snow begins in October and doesn't stop until May. 40 feet accumulates in the high passes. Workers dig tunnels through snow just to reach the tunnels through rock. Snow tunnels, hundreds of feet long, connecting barracks to work sites. Men work by candlelight in ice caves, chipping granite while avalanches rumble overhead. The winter of 1866 to 1867 is particularly brutal. Storms roll through every few days. The snow is so deep that chimneys on barracks are buried. Men dig vertical shafts to the surface just to get air. Supplies stop arriving. Food runs short. Barracks collapse under snow weight. Spring thaw reveals bodies. Some are still standing, frozen mid-stride, tools in hand, caught by an avalanche as they walked between barracks and worksite. Others are found in camps crushed by snow. One entire barracks, 20 men, was found intact, the men frozen in their bunks. They'd suffocated when the snow buried the structure and blocked all air. Estimates suggest over 1,000 Chinese workers died in the winter of 1866 to 1867 alone. The Big Four keep no public death records. When asked by newspaper reporters, they offer vague reassurances. Losses are minimal. Accidents are regrettable but unavoidable. The work is proceeding well. Charles Crocker, in a letter to his brother, is more candid. The Chinese are quiet, peaceable, patient, industrious, and economical. They are very docile in their habits and are content to work for less money than white labor. We have had no difficulty with them. Some have died from blasting accidents and snowslides, but not in sufficient numbers to affect our work. Not in sufficient numbers. That's how the Big Four see them. Not as men, as numbers. Expendable, replaceable, and when they're no longer useful, disposable. The strike, June 1867. Tunnel 6 is still not finished. Chinese workers have had enough. They strike. 3,000 men walk off the job simultaneously. A coordinated action organized through the Chinese 6 companies, mutual aid societies that function as labor guilds, benevolent associations, and the closest thing to a union the Chinese workers have. The demands are put in writing, delivered to Charles Crocker. The document, preserved in Stanford University archives, is remarkable for its clarity and restraint. Equal pay with white workers, $40 per month instead of $30. A 10-hour workday instead of 12 or sometimes 14. White workers already have 10-hour days. Why not Chinese? An end to corporal punishment. Foremen have been known to strike Chinese workers with canes or fists. One foreman, notorious for his brutality, was nicknamed the Hatchet because he carried one and threatened to use it. The right to leave work during severe weather. When storms make work impossible or deadly, white workers shelter in barracks. Chinese workers are often forced to continue. Protection from wage theft. Some foremen pocket a portion of Chinese wages, claiming fees or administrative costs that don't exist for white workers. The demands are reasonable. They're asking for equality, not privilege. Equal pay for equal work. Safe conditions. Basic dignity. Charles Crocker is furious. He sees the strike as betrayal. He's given these men jobs, hasn't he? Brought them from poverty in China to opportunity in America. And this is how they repay him? He orders all supplies to the work camps cut off. No food shipments from Sacramento. No rice. No dried fish. No vegetables. No water deliveries. The camps are in the High Sierra, miles from the nearest town. Without supplies, the strikers will starve. It's a siege. Crocker is betting the workers will break before he loses too much time on the construction schedule. The workers hold for 8 days. They ration what food they have. They melt snow for water. They stay unified. Not a single man crosses the line to return to work, but Crocker has resources they don't. On the 8th day, with food exhausted and men weakening, the strike leaders negotiate. They'll return to work if Crocker meets them halfway. Crocker refuses. Full capitulation or nothing. The workers have no choice. They return on Crocker's terms. Wages stay at $30 to $35. Hours stay at 12. The foremen keep their canes. The only concession Crocker makes is a vague promise to look into working conditions, a promise he never keeps. But he's shaken. The strike revealed that the Chinese workers, despite language barriers and lack of legal rights, could organize. They had demands, they had leverage, and they nearly succeeded. Crocker's response is to isolate the workers further. He brings in more laborers, expanding the workforce to over 12,000. More workers mean any individual is more replaceable. He rotates workers between camps, breaking up groups that might organize again. He spreads rumors that strikers will be blacklisted, their names sent back to China, shaming their families. The message is clear. You are here to work. You are not here to complain. And if you try this again, you will be crushed. 3 months later, Tunnel 6 breaks through. The moment is captured in a photograph now in the Huntington Library. White foremen and engineers stand at the tunnel mouth, smiling, tools in hand. Not a single Chinese face is visible in the frame. They were ordered to stand aside while the photograph was taken. The official record would show white men conquering the mountain. Progress accelerates. By 1868, the Central Pacific clears the Sierra and begins racing across the Nevada desert. The dying slows, but doesn't stop. Now it's heat, bad water, and accidents with grading equipment and rail cars. The desert heat reaches 110, 115 degrees. Men collapse. Some die of heat stroke before they can be carried to shade. Water sources are contaminated. Dysentery kills. Grading accidents crush. Rail cars derail and roll. Always more workers are needed. The numbers. How many Chinese workers died building the Central Pacific? The company never released figures. When pressed by journalists, Crocker and Stanford offered evasions. No more than necessary. Fewer than expected. The work is dangerous, but our men know the risks. Modern historians have attempted to reconstruct the toll by examining payroll records, cemetery records, letters home that were never delivered, and accounts from Chinese associations in San Francisco that tried to track their members. The estimates range from 1,200 to 2,000 deaths, though some researchers suggest the real number could be as high as 3,000 when accounting for deaths from disease, accidents outside of work, and men who simply vanished, perhaps walking away, but more likely dying alone in the wilderness. Most were buried where they fell. Work stopped just long enough to dig a shallow grave, mark it with a wooden stake if anything, then resumed. Railroad construction destroyed many of these graves as track was adjusted, ballast added, cuts widened. A few bodies were shipped back to China. Chinese tradition held that a man's bones should rest in his ancestral homeland. Families who could afford it paid for the body to be shipped to San Francisco, where bones were cleaned and packed in wooden boxes, then loaded onto ships bound for Canton. The cost was substantial. Often $100 or more, the equivalent of 3 to 4 months' wages. Most families couldn't afford it. In 1870, after the railroad was complete, the Chinese 6 companies organized an effort to exhume Chinese remains from along the route and ship them home. Teams walked the line, searching for graves. They found hundreds. Most were unmarked. Many bodies were unidentifiable. The bones were gathered, blessed, and sent west. But the effort was incomplete. Thousands of graves were never found. Today, almost none remain. The railroad destroyed some. Nature reclaimed others. A few grave sites persist in remote areas, marked by stone cairns that hikers occasionally stumble across, wondering who rests there and why. When the railroad was finished, most Chinese workers were laid off immediately. The Central Pacific retained a few hundred for track maintenance and section crews. The rest were released with their final pay and nothing else. No bonuses, no recognition, no thanks. Many returned to China if they'd saved enough for passage. Others stayed in California, taking whatever work they could find. Some became agricultural laborers, following the harvests. Others worked in fish canneries, laundries, or domestic service. Many settled in San Francisco's Chinatown, which grew from a few blocks to a sprawling district as workers arrived from the completed railroad, from played-out mines, from shuttered lumber camps. The erasure. Their contribution was erased almost immediately. Official histories credited white engineers and the Big Four's vision. The 1869 book, The Great Railroad, by William Bell, one of the first published accounts, mentions Chinese workers exactly 3 times in 400 pages, always in passing, never by name. Photographs from the time show almost no Chinese faces. The Central Pacific hired professional photographers to document the work, but the photographers were instructed to focus on locomotives, engineering features, and white supervisors. When Chinese workers appear, it's as background figures, out of focus, too far away to see clearly. At Promontory Summit, when the Golden Spike was driven, not a single Chinese worker was invited to the ceremony. The official guest list included politicians, railroad executives, army officers, and white foremen. The Chinese crews who had laid much of the track were ordered to stay at their camps, out of sight. One account survives from a Chinese worker who was there that day, recorded decades later by his grandson. The worker, whose name was recorded only as Grandfather Chin, said they watched from a distance as the ceremony proceeded. When it was over, white workers celebrated. The Chinese returned to their tents, cooked their evening meal, and the next morning were told to report for new assignments further west. The Southern Pacific was being built. They would build that too. The historical record is silent on their voices. Letters they wrote home rarely survived. Chinese newspapers from the era have mostly been lost. The workers themselves, if they lived long enough to tell their stories, often didn't. Shame kept them quiet. Many felt they'd failed. They'd come to Gold Mountain to make fortunes. Instead, they'd broken their bodies for wages barely sufficient to survive. It wasn't until the 1960s, driven by the civil rights movement and a new generation of Asian American historians, that the Chinese role began to be acknowledged. Scholars like Mark Lai and Philip Choi began excavating the history, tracking down surviving letters, interviewing descendants, searching archives for payroll records and company documents. In 2014, a century and a half later, the U.S. Department of Labor inducted Chinese railroad workers into its Hall of Honor. The ceremony was held in Washington. Descendants attended. A plaque was unveiled. In 2017, California placed a commemorative plaque at the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento. The text reads, "In memory of the thousands of Chinese railroad workers who helped build the western portion of the first Transcontinental Railroad." In 2019, on the 150th anniversary of the Golden Spike, ceremonies at Promontory Summit finally centered Chinese contributions. Descendants were invited. Speeches acknowledged what had been hidden. The Central Pacific's Chinese workforce, 90% of the total, was finally named. Late. Far too late. But something. The Central Pacific conquered the Sierra. The cost was blood, mostly Chinese, and fortunes, mostly for the Big Four. Now turn east. The Union Pacific faced different terrain but equal brutality. Chapter 3. Union Pacific, The Prairie Slaughter. 50 minutes to 78 minutes. The Great Platte Valley, Omaha, Nebraska. The Union Pacific breaks ground 2 years after the Central Pacific, delayed by the Civil War. The ceremony is modest. No governor, no band. Just a handful of officials, some local businessmen, and a photographer. General Dodge turns the first spade of earth. Thomas Durant gives a short speech about American destiny. Then everyone goes inside for whiskey because it's cold and nobody believes this will actually happen. But it does. Their route is easier at first. The Great Platte Valley offers a natural corridor west. Relatively flat, gently rising, following the Platte River across Nebraska and into Wyoming. No mountains for 600 miles, just endless prairie, vast and empty, stretching to the horizon in every direction. But the prairie has its own dangers. Labor. Thousands of men are needed. With the war ending in April 1865, soldiers muster out by the hundreds of thousands. Many are broken, missing limbs, shattered nerves, no prospects. The railroads offer work, hard work, dangerous work, but work. Irish immigrants flood American cities looking for anything. The potato famine of the 1840s drove millions from Ireland. They arrived in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, desperate and starving. Many took whatever labor they could find, digging canals, loading ships, building railroads. The Union Pacific recruits them by the trainload, promises wages, adventure, and a chance to build something historic. Most are desperate. Some are running from the law. All are expendable. The Union Pacific also hires Civil War veterans, both Union and Confederate. By 1866, the war is over and bitterness is fading. At least enough for men to work side by side if the pay is good. These men know discipline and can handle weapons, a necessity on the plains. Jack Casement, a Union Army general, runs track-laying crews with military precision. His brother Dan manages supplies. They're joined by freed slaves, men who fled plantations or were liberated by Union armies. They work for less than white workers, but more than they ever saw as slaves. They're given the hardest jobs, grading in the summer heat, hauling ties, working with explosives. German immigrants arrive, drawn by recruiters in New York and Cincinnati promising land grants along the route. Most don't get land. What they get is pick and shovel work. The workforce is rough, violent, and constantly drunk. Tent cities called Hell on Wheels follow the railroad west. Saloons, brothels, gambling dens, and violence. Shootings are nightly. The Union Pacific employs its own police force to keep minimal order, but the police are often as corrupt and brutal as the criminals. Patrick's story. Patrick Duffy, age 26, from County Cork, arrived in New York in 1863, joined the Union Army, served 2 years, mustered out in 1865 with $30 in back pay and no prospects. Heard the Union Pacific was hiring, took a train to Omaha, signed on for $2.50 a day. He writes letters home to his sister in Cork. A few survive, preserved by descendants who donated them to the Nebraska State Historical Society. April 1866. The work is hard, but the pay is steady. We lay track from dawn till dark. My hands are covered in blisters, but they say that will pass. The food is beans and salt pork. I miss your bread. July 1866. We've crossed into the Platte Valley. It's flat as a table as far as you can see. The sun is brutal. Men collapse from the heat. We bury them where they fall and move on. I send you $15. Use it to feed the children. October 1866. The Indians attacked last week, shot arrows into the camp at night. Killed 2 men, wounded 4. We carry rifles now while we work. I never thought I'd have to fight again after the war ended. But this is different. These people are defending their land. I don't know who's right anymore. February 1867. It's so cold my breath freezes. We work through it. Jack Casement says if we don't keep moving, the Central Pacific will take all the subsidies and we'll be out of work. A man froze to death last night. He'd been drinking and passed out outside his tent. We found him in the morning, stiff as a board. May 1867. We laid 3 miles of track today. It's a record. Everyone is proud, but I'm just tired. I think about coming home. I've saved nearly $200. That's enough for passage and a bit left over. But Jack says if I stay through the summer, there's a bonus. I'll decide soon. The letters stop in June 1867. Patrick Duffy's name appears in a Union Pacific accident report from that month. He was crushed between two freight cars during a coupling operation. The report notes, P. Duffy, laborer, age 26, killed instantly. Body shipped to Omaha for burial. Next of kin notified. His sister in Cork received a letter from the railroad company, a form letter with his name filled in by hand. It expressed regret and informed her that his final wages, $23.40, would be sent to her if she provided an address for payment. There's no record of whether she ever received it. Patrick Duffy is buried in Omaha. His grave is marked. He's one of the lucky ones. Construction. Construction on the Union Pacific is brute force. Grading crews with scrapers pulled by mules or oxen carve the roadbed. Men with shovels follow, smoothing the grade to exact specifications. Surveyors mark the route with stakes. Grading crews can be miles ahead of the track layers. Track laying is choreographed chaos. A construction train, called a work train, brings materials to the end of the completed track. Flat cars carry rails, ties, spikes, and tools. Men unload ties, placing them at precise intervals. A rail, 30 feet long and weighing 560 pounds, is lifted by 8 to 10 men and carried forward. They drop it on the ties. Spikers follow, driving spikes with sledgehammers. 4 spikes per rail, 2 per tie. A good crew can spike a rail in 30 seconds. The process repeats. Tie, rail, spike. Tie, rail, spike. Hour after hour. The rhythm is constant. The noise is deafening. Hammers ring on spikes. Men shout. Foremen curse. The train inches forward as track appears behind it. A good crew can lay a mile of track in a day. The record, set on April 28, 1869, in a race against the Central Pacific, is 10 miles and 56 feet in a single 12-hour shift. That's 3,520 rails, 14,080 spikes, all lifted, placed, and driven by hand. The men who set that record were legendary. They were also utterly destroyed. Several collapsed at the end of the day. One died that night from exhaustion and heat stroke. But the prairie is not empty.
The Indian Wars. The Transcontinental Railroad cuts through the heart of Native American territory. Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Pawnee. For them, the railroad is an invasion. The Iron Road brings buffalo hunters who slaughter herds by the millions, leaving carcasses to rot, taking only hides and tongues. It brings settlers who plow sacred lands. It brings soldiers who enforce treaties signed under duress and then ignored. The Great Plains in 1865 are contested ground. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 guaranteed vast territories to the Sioux and Cheyenne. The treaty was broken almost immediately. Gold discoveries in Colorado and Montana brought floods of miners across native lands. The government did nothing to stop them. The Sand Creek Massacre, November 1864. Colorado militia attack a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho camp. Over 150 killed, mostly women, children, and elderly. The militia mutilates bodies, taking scalps, genitals, and other trophies. The massacre is condemned, even by some in the military, but no one is punished. Attacks on the Union Pacific begin almost immediately. Small raids at first, surveyors ambushed, a grading crew burned, track torn up at night. The Union Pacific responds with armed guards. Soldiers from nearby forts patrol the line, workers carry rifles while they work. Blockhouses are built every few miles, small fortified structures where workers can take shelter during attacks. The Plum Creek Massacre, August 6, 1867. Plum Creek, Nebraska, a war party of Cheyenne, estimated at 50 to 100 men, decides to derail a train. They pry up a section of rail using tools stolen from a work crew. They pile railroad ties on the track. Then they wait. Around 10 p.m., a handcar carrying a repair crew of 5 men approaches. The handcar hits the gap in the track and derails. 2 men are killed instantly. 2 escape into the darkness. One is captured. His name is William Thompson. The Cheyenne warriors scalp him while he's still alive. They think he's dead and leave him. Thompson regains consciousness, finds his scalp lying nearby, picks it up, and staggers toward the nearest station miles away. He survives. Doctors attempt to reattach his scalp, but it doesn't take. Thompson keeps it preserved in a jar of alcohol for the rest of his life, occasionally displaying it at county fairs. Hours later, a freight train approaches the same spot. The engineer sees something on the track, but can't stop in time. The locomotive derails, the train crashes, cars overturn, the wreck burns. The Cheyenne warriors loot the wreckage and burn what remains. The telegraph operator at Plum Creek Station sends word east and west. General Sherman, commanding U.S. forces on the plains, issues orders. The railroad will be built. Any Indian resistance will be punished with the most extreme severity. His policy: total war. Not just against warriors, but against entire tribes. Destroy villages, kill food supplies, force surrender through starvation and terror. The violence escalates. Entire villages are destroyed. Women and children are killed. The famous Sand Creek massacre is not isolated, it's policy. The railroad is not just transportation, it's a weapon. It allows rapid deployment of troops. It brings supplies and reinforcements. It's the spine of American expansion, and expansion means the elimination of native resistance. Red Cloud's War, 1866-1868. The Sioux leader, Red Cloud, wages guerrilla war against forts along the Bozeman Trail in Wyoming and Montana. The trail crosses Sioux hunting grounds to reach Montana goldfields. The U.S. military builds forts to protect travelers. The Sioux attack supply trains, ambush patrols, and lay siege to forts. The Fetterman Fight, December 1866. Captain William Fetterman leads 80 soldiers from Fort Phil Kearny to rescue a woodcutting detail under attack. It's a trap. Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors under Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and others ambush the column. All 80 soldiers are killed. Bodies are mutilated. A message. The war ends with the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. The U.S. abandons the Bozeman Trail forts. The Sioux agree to cease attacks. The treaty establishes the Great Sioux Reservation, covering much of present-day South Dakota. It's a victory for Red Cloud, one of the few times the U.S. concedes territory in a treaty. But the Transcontinental Railroad is south of Sioux territory. It crosses Cheyenne and Arapaho lands. The attacks continue, but they're raids, not war. The railroad keeps pushing west. By 1869, the Great Sioux War is not yet finished, but the railroad crosses their southern border. The message is clear. This is not negotiable. How many Native Americans died fighting or fleeing the railroad? Hundreds in direct combat. Thousands across the broader Indian wars that the railroad enabled and accelerated. Their land, millions of acres, was taken. The buffalo they depended on were slaughtered to near extinction deliberately, to starve them into submission. The Union Pacific paid nothing for this land. The government granted it. The army cleared it. The cost was borne by people who had no voice, no vote, and no legal recourse. Hell on wheels. As the Union Pacific advances, temporary towns spring up every few months. Julesburg, Cheyenne, Laramie, Benton, Corinne. Each one follows the same pattern. Canvas tents and wooden shacks thrown up in days. Saloons and brothels open before the track reaches town. Gamblers, prostitutes, conmen, and thieves arrive ahead of the workers, ready to separate them from their wages. Julesburg, Nebraska, 1867. Population explodes to 4,000 in a matter of weeks. 23 saloons, 5 brothels, gambling dens in every tent, shootings every night. The ground is so saturated with blood and whiskey that residents say it squelches when you walk. A description from a newspaper correspondent. Julesburg is a city of tents and wickedness. Every vice known to civilized man is practiced here without shame. Murder is common. Theft is universal. The law does not exist beyond the reach of a man's rifle. Women of low character ply their trade openly. Whiskey flows more freely than water. This is civilization's cutting edge, and it is sharp, bloody, and drunk. Violence is constant. Shootings, stabbings, beatings. Men work 12-hour days in brutal heat or freezing cold, then drink themselves senseless, brawl, and gamble away their pay. By morning, they're back on the line, hungover, broke, and starting the cycle again. The Union Pacific tolerates it. Drunk workers are still workers. Dead workers are replaced. The only rule is, keep the track moving forward. One account from a Union Pacific foreman describes the typical Saturday night. By sundown, the men have their pay. By midnight, half are insensible from drink. Fights break out over cards, women, or slights real or imagined. I've seen men knife each other over a poker hand. The next morning, we drag the survivors to work and bury the dead where they fell. The track moves west, and hell moves with it. Julesburg lasts 4 months. When the track moves beyond it, the town empties in days. Buildings are disassembled and carried to the next site. By mid-1868, Julesburg is a ghost town. Only a few permanent residents remain, staring at the empty plains where thousands had lived. Benton, Wyoming, 1868, called the wickedest city in America by Harper's Weekly. Population 3,000, almost all male, almost all criminal. Lasted 3 months. When the railroad moved west, the buildings were dismantled and carried forward. The town literally moved. A visitor's account. Benton is hell incarnate. Gambling, prostitution, and murder are the primary industries. The law is whatever a man's gun says it is. I witnessed 3 killings in as many days. No one was arrested. Bodies were dragged to the edge of town and left for coyotes. This is not civilization. This is barbarism wearing civilized dress. Hell on wheels was efficient. It followed the money. It provided the bare minimum to keep workers functional, and it left nothing behind but trash, graves, and ash. The dying never stops. Heat, cold, accidents, disease, violence, always more workers are needed. When one falls, another takes his place. The Crédit Mobilier scandal. While workers died on the plains, a different crime was unfolding in boardrooms. Thomas Durant, vice president of the Union Pacific, created a construction company called Crédit Mobilier of America. On paper, it was independent. In reality, Durant and his partners controlled both the railroad and the construction company. Here's the scam. The Union Pacific would contract with Crédit Mobilier to build the railroad. Crédit Mobilier would charge inflated prices, sometimes double or triple the actual cost. The Union Pacific would pay with government bonds and its own stock. Crédit Mobilier would pocket the difference. Example: a mile of track on the plains cost roughly $30,000 to build in materials and labor. Crédit Mobilier charged the Union Pacific $96,000 per mile. The excess $66,000 went to Durant and his partners as profit. The beauty of the scheme was that the same men sat on both sides of the deal. They negotiated with themselves, approved contracts they wrote, and collected profits from both companies. To protect the scam, they bribed congressmen. Oakes Ames, a congressman from Massachusetts and Union Pacific investor, handled the bribes. He distributed shares in Crédit Mobilier to key politicians at no cost or far below market value. When the company paid dividends, often 50% to 100% annually, these politicians made fortunes. Ames kept a list: Vice President Schuyler Colfax, future President James Garfield, Speaker of the House James G. Blaine. Dozens of representatives and senators, all received stock. All stayed quiet. The scam worked for years. The Union Pacific collected government bonds, Crédit Mobilier collected inflated payments, investors made fortunes, and the taxpayers who backed the bonds were left holding the bill. The total take from Crédit Mobilier was estimated at $23 million, equivalent to over $500 million today. In 1872, a newspaper exposed the scheme. The New York Sun published details provided by a disgruntled Crédit Mobilier investor. The scandal exploded. Congressional hearings followed. Oakes Ames was censured by the House of Representatives. Schuyler Colfax's political career ended. Garfield's reputation was tarnished, but he survived to become president. Several congressmen resigned, but no one went to jail. The railroad was finished, the bonds were issued, the money was gone. And the men who profited kept most of their wealth. It remains one of the largest financial frauds in American history. The human cost. How many workers died building the Union Pacific? Again, no accurate records exist. The company didn't care to count. When men died, they were replaced. That's all that mattered to the bosses. Modern estimates range from 500 to over 1,000. Some historians suggest the true number could be higher when accounting for deaths in Hell on Wheels towns, men who died from disease or violence off the worksite but still connected to the railroad. Causes: accidents with blasting powder and nitroglycerin, crushed by equipment, derailments, heat stroke in summer, hypothermia in winter, dysentery from bad water, cholera outbreaks in camps, violence in Hell on Wheels towns, Indian attacks. John O'Brien, age 32, from Dublin, hired in Omaha in spring 1867. Killed in a blasting accident in Wyoming that November. The powder charge detonated while he was setting it. 3 other men were injured. O'Brien's body was buried beside the track. His name appears in a payroll ledger with the notation, "Deceased. Final pay $460 sent to Omaha, forwarding address." Michael Flanagan, age 28, from Galway, worked grading crews in Nebraska, died of cholera in June 1866. Cholera hit the camps hard that summer. Bad water, close quarters, poor sanitation. Men sickened and died within hours. Flanagan was delirious with fever when he died. His bunkmates buried him in a shallow grave and moved his belongings to the side for anyone who wanted them. No one did. They were burned to prevent contagion. Sean Murphy, age 24, from Cork. Shot in a saloon brawl in Julesburg in March 1867. An argument over a card game escalated. Murphy was unarmed. The other man wasn't. No charges were filed. Murphy was buried in Julesburg's Boot Hill Cemetery. His grave marker, a wooden plank with his name carved, rotted away years ago. Bodies were buried beside the tracks in unmarked graves. A few were shipped home if families paid, but the cost was prohibitive. Most were simply gone. Workers who knew them might remember their names for a few weeks, then new men arrived, and the old names were forgotten. The Union Pacific treated workers as consumable resources. When one died, another was hired. The track kept moving. Irish immigrants made up the majority of the Union Pacific workforce. Their names appear in scattered payroll records, but little else. Patrick, Michael, Sean, John, dead at 20, 30, 40, no memorials, no pensions for widows, no compensation. Unlike Chinese labourers, Irish workers were not systematically excluded after the railroad was finished. Many stayed with the railroad, working maintenance or moving to other construction projects. Some became foremen or engineers. Others settled in the West, starting businesses or homesteading. But the Irish who died building the railroad were no less forgotten than the Chinese. No plaques, no halls of honor. They were simply the cost of doing business. By 1869, the Union Pacific had laid over 1,000 miles of track. They crossed Nebraska, Wyoming, and into Utah. Ahead lay the final push to Promontory Summit and the race's climax. The dying was almost over. The celebration was about to begin, and the truth was about to be buried for a very long time. The final race spring, 1869. The Central Pacific and Union Pacific close in on each other. The Pacific Railroad Act didn't specify where they would meet. Each company wanted to build as many miles as possible before the junction. More miles meant more bonds, more land grants, more profit. The race became absurd. At one point, the two companies graded parallel routes within sight of each other, sometimes within 100 feet, each refusing to stop. Congress finally intervened and designated Promontory Summit, Utah Territory, as the meeting point. The Central Pacific, slower through the mountains, made up time across Nevada. Chinese crews graded and laid track at a ferocious pace. The record day, April 28, 1869. 10 miles and 56 feet of track laid in 12 hours. It's a record that stood for decades. The Union Pacific, racing across Wyoming, cut corners. Shoddy grading, weak bridges, poorly ballasted track. It was fast but dangerous. Within years, entire sections would need to be rebuilt. May 10, 1869. Promontory Summit. The engines, Jupiter from the Central Pacific and Number in 119 from the Union Pacific, are positioned pilot to pilot on the final section of track. Dignitaries arrive. Leland Stanford represents the Central Pacific. Thomas Durant, delayed by a worker strike, even at the end, labor troubles, arrives late for the Union Pacific. Telegraph wires connect the ceremony to the nation. When the golden spike is driven, the signal will flash to New York, San Francisco, and every city in between. Cannons will fire. Bells will ring. The golden spike isn't gold. Not entirely. It's engraved, plated, and ceremonial. 4 spikes total are used: gold, silver, gold and silver combined, each donated by states or sponsors, each inscribed with lofty language about unity and progress. Stanford swings the hammer. He misses. The crowd laughs. Durant swings. He misses too. Finally, a railroad worker steps in and drives the spike home. At 12:47 p.m., the telegraph operator taps, "Done." Across America, celebration erupts. In New York, Wall Street shuts down for a parade. In San Francisco, cannons boom at Fort Point. In Chicago, a 7-mile procession winds through the city. The dream is real. You can board a train in New York and step off in San Francisco 6 days later. No wagon train, no ships, no months of danger and hardship. The continent is bridged. The photographs from that day are famous. 2 locomotives, a crowd of men in dark suits and top hats. Champagne bottles held high. Look closely. Count the Chinese faces. You'll find one, maybe 2, far in the background, barely visible. The men who built the railroad, who blasted through the Sierra, who died by the hundreds in snow and granite, were not invited. They were invisible. And for a century, they would remain so. The aftermath. Wealth. The Big Four of the Central Pacific became titans. Leland Stanford, Governor of California, U.S. Senator, founder of Stanford University, built with railroad wealth. His San Francisco mansion covered an entire city block. When he died in 1893, his estate was valued at $50 million, over $1.5 billion today. Collis P. Huntington. He outlived the others, controlling vast railroad, shipbuilding, and real estate empires. At his death in 1900, his fortune approached $70 million. Mark Hopkins died in 1878, leaving $20 million. His widow built the Hopkins Mansion on Nob Hill, one of the most opulent residences in America. Charles Crocker died in 1888, worth $24 million. His mansion, also on Nob Hill, was a monument to excess. Together, the Big Four controlled California's economy. Their Southern Pacific Railroad, built using the same methods and labor, monopolized transportation. They set freight rates, controlled politicians, and crushed competition. They were called the Octopus, a corporation with tentacles in every aspect of Western life. The Union Pacific's leaders fared differently. Thomas Durant died in 1885, relatively poor. The Crédit Mobilier scandal destroyed his reputation. Oliver Ames, Oakes's brother, was ruined financially and reputationally. Oakes himself died shortly after his censure, disgraced. But others connected to the Union Pacific profited. Jay Gould, who bought control in the 1870s, looted it and walked away wealthy. Sidney Dillon, a president of the Union Pacific, left millions. The land grants, over 20 million acres, became the foundation of enormous wealth. Railroads sold land to settlers at inflated prices. They leased grazing rights. They mined coal and minerals. The Transcontinental Railroad was profitable not because of ticket sales, but because of land theft made legal by Congress. The aftermath: betrayal Chinese workers. After the Golden Spike, the Central Pacific laid off nearly all its Chinese crews within weeks. No bonuses, no pensions, no recognition. Many returned to China, if they could afford passage. Others stayed in California, taking whatever work they could find. Agriculture, domestic service, laundries. Chinatowns in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and other cities became refuges. Then came the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first U.S. law to ban immigration based on race. It was driven partly by economic competition, white workers resented Chinese labor, and partly by racism. The act stayed in force until 1943. Chinese contributions to the railroad were scrubbed from popular memory. School textbooks credited brave pioneers, and bold engineers. Photographs were curated to show white faces. Histories written in the early 20th century barely mentioned Chinese workers, and when they did, it was often dismissive or derogatory. It wasn't until the 1960s, driven by the civil rights movement and a new generation of Asian American historians, that the Chinese role began to be acknowledged. In 2014, a century and a half later, the U.S. Department of Labor inducted Chinese railroad workers into its Hall of Honor. In 2017, California placed a commemorative plaque. In 2019, on the 150th anniversary of the Golden Spike, ceremonies finally centered Chinese contributions. Late, far too late. But something. Native Americans. The Transcontinental Railroad accelerated their destruction. Buffalo herds, estimated at 30 million in 1850, fell to fewer than 1,000 by 1890. Without buffalo, plains tribes starved. Reservations, established by treaties that were routinely broken, confined survivors to marginal lands. The Transcontinental Railroad brought settlers by the million. In 1869, the Great Plains were native territory. By 1890, they were states: Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, the Dakotas. The railroad didn't cause genocide by itself, but it was the instrument that made it fast, efficient, and irreversible. Irish workers. Unlike Chinese laborers, Irish workers were not systematically excluded. Many stayed with the railroad, working maintenance or moving to other construction projects. Some became foremen or engineers. Others settled in the West, starting businesses or homesteading. But the Irish who died building the railroad were no less forgotten than the Chinese. No plaques, no halls of honor. They were simply the cost of doing business. The question of cost. So, who paid for the Transcontinental Railroad? Workers. Chinese laborers who dynamited through the Sierra for half wages and no safety protections. Irish immigrants who died on the plains from accidents, disease, and violence. Native Americans who lost their land, their food source, and their lives. Taxpayers. Federal bonds, backed by tax revenue, financed much of the construction. The Crédit Mobilier scandal proved those funds were looted. When the Union Pacific defaulted on its bonds in later years, taxpayers absorbed the loss. The land itself. 20 million acres of public land, granted to private companies, sold for profit. That land belonged, in theory, to all Americans. In practice, it made a handful of men unimaginably wealthy. How much did the dream cost? In dollars, roughly $100 million in direct construction costs, equivalent to $3 billion today. Add the bonds, the land grants, and the long-term economic benefits captured privately, and the true cost is far higher. In lives, 2,000 to 3,000 workers dead, likely more. Tens of thousands of Native Americans killed or displaced. Buffalo herds exterminated, cultures destroyed. In integrity, one of the largest financial frauds in American history. Political corruption on a scale that shocked even the Gilded Age. A system where the builders became rich while the workers were expendable and forgotten. The Transcontinental Railroad was a triumph. It shrank the continent. It enabled commerce, migration, and growth on a scale unimaginable before. It helped make America a continental power, but it was built on blood, bones, and lies, and for a very long time, we chose to remember only the Golden Spike. What remains? The Transcontinental Railroad still runs. Not the original route in every section. Many miles have been upgraded, rerouted, or double-tracked. But you can still ride from Omaha to Sacramento, following roughly the path laid in the 1860s. The summit tunnels in the Sierra, carved by Chinese workers with hand drills and nitroglycerin, are still used by freight trains. More than 150 years later, the granite holds. Promontory Summit, where the Golden Spike was driven, is a National Historic Site. The locomotives, replicas of Jupiter and Numbalos, IM-119, are positioned pilot to pilot. Rangers lead tours, reenactments are staged each May 10th. But walk the site, read the plaques, ask yourself whose story is told. For decades, it was the Big Four, the engineers, the vision of American expansion. Only recently has the full truth, The Chinese workers, the Irish dead, the native land theft been added. The cost. We didn't count environmental. The railroad opened the West to exploitation. Forests logged, mines dug, rivers dammed. Within 50 years, landscapes that had existed for millennia were transformed. Cultural, Native American cultures, languages and traditions were suppressed or destroyed. Boarding schools forced children to abandon their heritage. The railroad was part of a broader campaign to civilize the West, a campaign that was really erasure. Economic. The wealth created by the Transcontinental Railroad concentrated in very few hands. The Big Four, the Union Pacific investors, the land speculators. Workers, the people who actually built it, received wages and nothing more. No shares, no land, no legacy. The question that remains: can beauty and progress be built on injustice and still be celebrated? The Transcontinental Railroad was beautiful. The engineering was extraordinary. The vision was bold. The result was transformative. But it was built by men who died for wages they barely received, whose bodies were buried in unmarked graves, whose contributions were erased. It was built on land taken by force from people who had lived there for thousands of years. It was financed by one of the most corrupt schemes in American history. Do we celebrate the achievement and ignore the cost? Or do we reckon with both? The answer, slowly and imperfectly, is both. We can honor the workers without excusing the system that exploited them. We can marvel at the engineering without ignoring the lives it consumed. We can remember that great things are often built by small people, and those small people deserve their names in the story. The Transcontinental Railroad changed America. It made us a continent-spanning nation. It enabled the economy we have today, and it cost far more than anyone was willing to admit for over a century. The Golden Spike was driven in 1869, but the reckoning is still unfinished. The dark story of the Transcontinental Railroad. Workers who built a nation and were forgotten. Bosses who made fortunes and wrote the history. A dream that united a continent and divided its people. If you enjoyed this deep investigation into America's railroads and the workers who built them, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Tell me in the comments, which railroad should we explore next? The Orient Express, luxury, murder, and spies crossing Europe. The London Underground, the first subway system, and the lives it swallowed. The Trans-Siberian Railway, the longest railroad on Earth, built by exiles and prisoners. Or perhaps something closer to home. The Pennsylvania Railroad, the New York subway, the Chicago elevated trains. These aren't just railways, they're stories, built by real people, paid for with real costs, and preserved through real struggle. Every railroad has its shadows. Every spike has its price. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next investigation.